system.
This meeting is being recorded.
Anglo-Saxons, myth and reality. There we have them.
This is our next door neighbour, dear, Mr.
Horsa, son of Ethelred.
Oh, not Ethelred, the unready.
Oh, no, my dad was always ready, so my mum said.
How do you do, Mr. Horsa? Oh, please excuse the way I look, but I haven't had chance to put on a lick of woad this morning.
Not at all. You look lovely.
My name's Pod, Hengist Pod. This is my wife, Senna.
Senna? Oh, that's a pretty...
Pretty what?
Pretty name.
It was, till I married somebody called Pod.
Yeah, well, that's the carry-on version. Hengist and Horsa being Celts instead of Saxons, but there you go. They don't get everything right in Carry On Cleo. A couple of things wrong. So, the traditional story. Prehistoric Britain was occupied by a group of people called the Celts. Then the Romans invaded and eventually subdued the southern part of Britain and then built Hadrian's Wall at the northern end to keep the Picts at bay. 400 years later, the Romans withdrew their legions and that left Britain defenceless. Germanic mercenaries were invited to help defend the island, but they then turned on their hosts and with other Germanic raiders began to occupy the island, displacing the Celts and pushing them westward. The Celtic people were slowly pushed westward into what we now know as Wales and Cornwall, and some fled across to what later became known as Brittany, with others to Galicia. Anglo-Saxon and Jutes occupied and ruled the East, known collectively as Anglo-Saxons. They founded 7 kingdoms known as the Heptarchy until they were finally united as England. So that's the story that usually was told in schools and elsewhere and on film and whatever. So, firstly, pre-Roman Britain. Of course, the first thing to say is that people of pre-Roman Britain didn't call themselves Celts. They had their own tribal names and distinct territories. There's some there, the Iceni, Brigante or whatever. However, by the time of the Roman invasion, they did speak a variation of the same language, which later became known as Common Brythonic. The Brythonic tribes had enjoyed growing diplomatic and trading links with the Romans in the century since Julius Caesar's expeditions in 55 and 54 BCE. In the south, Roman economic and cultural influence played a significant part in Brythonic society. The Brythonic tribes were a lot more sophisticated than used to be imagined. They had a stable societal structure, and those in the south and the east of the islands minted their own coins. It was the displacing of friendly rulers that led to the decision of the Romans to invade the islands to secure their trade and tributes. In 43 CE, the invasions began, and over the next 60 years or so, Roman rule was established and continued south of Hadrian's Wall. So Roman Britain. Initially, the Romans were simply an occupying force, separate from the indigenous population. At one point, over 40,000 troops were garrisoned in Britain, accounting for just over 12% of the total Roman army. The need to build support structures around the legions saw a rise in immigration from the empire and a developing local economy. Over the next 300 years, the Roman Empire slowly changed, and this was reflected in Britain. Many of the Roman towns began to shrink in size and importance, and many of the large stone buildings were abandoned. There was, though, an expansion in the building of large villas on the outskirts of the towns. And this saw Roman influence expand deeper into British society, and a distinct Romano-British culture developed. Then in 401, CE, a large number of troops were withdrawn from Britain to assist with the war against Alaric I, who was attempting to sack Rome. Then in 407, the remaining Roman garrisons proclaimed one of their generals, Constantine, Emperor of the Western Roman Empire. Constantine then gathered a force and crossed the English Channel to invade Gaul, leaving Britain with only a skeleton force to defend itself. Having been left defenceless, the Britons rebelled in 408 and expelled the final remnants of Roman authority in 409. In 410, with increased incursions from the Saxons, Scots, Picts, and Angles, the Britons wrote to the Roman Emperor Honorius for help. He refused and told the Britons to look to their own defences. This letter marks the definite end of Roman Britain. The period after 410 was once called post-Roman Britain by historians, but in the past couple of decades, archaeologists have discovered that life carried on much as before, and this period is now becoming known as sub-Roman to indicate the continuing influence of Roman culture. It was thought that the Britons simply reverted back to their pre-Roman ways, but it now seems that the Romano-British culture that had developed continued with trading links with Rome and the continent. The large abandoned stone buildings were not just left to rot, but were repurposed for practical use. And other large wooden buildings were built to replace them. As you can see there, that's a villa built after the Romans left. And after the legions were withdrawn, the Romano-British began to leave the Roman towns and re-establish the more defensible old hill forts. Because the Romans had deliberately left their towns with weak defences, so in the case of a revolt, the legions could easily retake them. The old forts along Hadrian's Wall were occupied and adapted, and new communities emerged, and local leaders arose as central power fragmented. These were not much more than local warlords who could maintain some sort of order, and they would later sort of morph into become petty kings. Now, Tintagel is very interesting because Britain was not isolated, and there remained a lively trade with the Eastern Roman Empire based in Constantinople. Evidence has been found in Tintagel of pottery originated in the huge kilns of southern Anatolia, that's modern-day Turkey. Huge containers were used for transporting olive oil and wine. These would be exchanged for tin, what the Romans called the British metal. There's also evidence that alongside this lively trade network, there were also diplomatic, religious, and cultural exchanges between the west of Britain, especially, and the Eastern Roman Empire. Latin continued to be used. It was a very formal and sometimes quite flowery form of Latin, and it continued to be used not just by the monastic elites. A series of stone memorials across Western Britain have Latin inscriptions on them, and they were inscribed not by monks but by lay people. Earlier historians and linguists dismissed them as crude attempts of Latin prose. It was only until quite recently that I discovered that they were actually Latin verse. They were also quite sophisticated in their structure, and some contained hidden meanings and messages. You'd read the verse, and if you reversed it or you took the certain letters, it told you who had actually written it, things like that. The widespread use of these across Western Britain also means that they could be understood by the wider populations and not just an educated elite. They were often markers for people who had died, etc. So the political structure of sub-Roman Britain. In the West, a Roman influence remained, with evidence that some elements of the old Roman political structure continued in kingdoms like Powys, Difford and Gwynedd. These kingdoms, though, often fought between themselves, which weakened their ability to resist any raids from outside. So it didn't just revert back to the old tribal setup of pre-Roman. Yeah, actually, kingdoms did develop. There's only 4 written sources dealing with this period that were wrote around the time. There's 3 internal ones and an external one. The first internal one is St. Patrick's Confessio. This was a depiction of his life written around the mid-5th century, so just after the Roman legions left. In it, he describes his home, which was, nobody quite knows where, but it was in the west of Britain. And he describes a structured Romano-British society that is very stable. His only mention of invaders or raiders are from the Picts, who came from Scotland, then nowadays called Scotland, or the Scots, who came from what's now called Ireland. It's confusing, but never mind. The second internal source for this period comes from a British monk called Gildas, who I think we met before, who wrote on the ruin and conquest of Britain. It's thought that he was writing this at some time between 490 and 550 CE, with the likeliest being probably 510 to 530, so roughly 100 years after the Romans had left. The problem with Gildas's writing is that it's not a history as such, but a diatribe in 3 parts condemning the acts of Gildas' contemporaries, both secular and religious, whom he blames for the dire state of affairs that had developed in Britain. He gives no dates or context or even locations for the events he describes. Part 1 is an uneven narrative of British history from the Roman conquest to his own time, although he does get lots of facts wrong, like he was 200 years out when Hadrian's Wall was built. Part 2 is a condemnation of 5 kings for their various sins. These include obscure figures that we know very little about and relatively well documented ones. And part 3 is a similar attack upon British clergy that he disagreed with. According to the traditional reading of Gildas, an overlord emerged by the name of Vortigan, although the name Vortigan actually means great king or overlord in Brythonic, so no one's quite sure if he really did exist or not. It was Vortigan who invited the Saxons, Hengist and Horsa, there they are, the old and the new versions, to help defend Britain from the Picts. He married Hengist's daughter, Rowena. That's a picture there of them getting married. And in return, he gave them Kent. Then came the invasion of the Germanic tribes and the subjugation of the Britons. Recent reinterpretations of his work, however, have led to a consensus among historians who now believe that he wrote of mercenaries who were brought in as auxiliaries to help defend towns from Picts and Scots, who returned home when they were no longer needed. There's a bit of, because of the style of writing, there's confusion about what he's actually describing. And like I say, there's no dates, no locations for anything. The third source from the internals group was the Venerable Bead. He was another monk who was writing 100 years after Gildas and who basically lifted his history from him and then added his own little embellishments. And it's Bead who claimed that Vortigan was actually king of the British. This version of events then influenced the historiography of the period right up to the present day. The external source that I mentioned comes from Germanus of Auxerre, and he was describing his visit to Britain. Again, in his description, he portrays a stable society with the main threat coming from the Picts and the Scots. He had been sent to combat something called Pelagianism, and basically it was a belief that there was no such thing as original sin, and the Roman Church wanted to stamp that out. But before he was a clergyman, he was a general, and he ended up leading an army of the British against the Picts. They think somewhere in North Wales, but no one's quite sure. But none of these accounts actually corroborates the idea of an invasion by the Anglo-Saxons. So the Anglo-Saxons. There's no doubt that there was a cultural change after the end of Roman rule. In the East, Common Brythonic faded from use and Latin disappeared completely. Paganism mostly supplanted Christianity in the beliefs of the population. New rulers emerged and the culture of the island became more Germanic. The question is, how and why did this happen? Was it through invasion and violent suppression of the Celts? Was it through foreign elites gaining dominance and so the Celtic culture was absorbed and then completely disappeared? Or was it a combination of both? Because of the continued influence of accounts by Gildas and Bead, helped along by our old friends, the Victorian historians, who love the idea of the Anglo-Saxon race conquering Britain, the story of conquest, slaughter, and displacement remains dominant. Subsequently, this influenced the archaeological findings, which seem to confirm a decisive break between the Roman and Anglo-Saxon periods. Modern dating techniques, new discoveries in genetics, combined with new approaches in archaeology and a reassessment of previously held beliefs, have challenged this. In fact, many historians are now arguing that the term Anglo-Saxon is in itself problematic. When discoveries have been made from this period, they are called Anglo-Saxon before any work is ever started on them. And this predicates the answer. Late and early antique or early medieval, more neutral terms have been suggested. There's a picture of the heptarchy, as people thought. The people of this period, you won't be surprised to hear, never referred to themselves as Anglo-Saxons. The first usage of the term came from Francia, and it was only used to distinguish the language spoken by the people in England from the Germanic languages of the continent. What the people in England actually called themselves had more to do with where they actually lived, people of the hill, people of the river, or whatever, and tribal and loyalties beyond that. So Mercians, or I don't know what he calls them from Wessex, a Wessaxonian or something. I don't know what they call themselves. We don't really know. Then we come to the Saxon shore forts. The Saxon shore forts were a string of strongholds built by the Romans in the early 3rd century along the east and south coast of England. Traditionally, these fortifications, and there's some others on the in northern Gaul, had been viewed as coastal defences erected against a Saxon menace. Elaborate scenarios involving fleets and signal towers have been created to describe how such a defensive system might have worked. However, the evidence for any of this is virtually non-existent. Due to this, more recent scholarship has emphasised the role of the forts as transit points and secure compounds for the temporary storage of supplies destined for Gaul. The Saxon shore is a term coined much later in a Roman description of the island. The theory that Saxons were actually beginning to settle in Britain during the late Roman period is backed up by archaeological excavations that have found an unbroken occupation of sites that slowly evolved before, during, and after the Roman period. And as you can see there, the forts do tend to match up with where there was settlement by Saxons. Then we come to burial sites. Graves and burial sites have been excavated since the 1920s. They were generally classified as being Anglo-Saxon or Celtic, depending on how the people were buried. Were they in a flexed or supine position? Did they have grave goods, etc.? Now, advances in genetics and DNA have allowed scientists to determine the origins of bodies. Surprisingly, it has been found that many cemeteries contain both Celts and Saxons in very similar graves. There were also sometimes people from other parts of Europe and sometimes even North Africa. More recently, advances in dental bioarchaeology and isotope analysis have allowed us to determine, when I say us, I'm talking generally, not me, where these people were actually born and grew up. This is done by examining the enamel on teeth of the buried. They found that many of those presumed to be Celtic were genetically Saxon, but were actually born in the local area. Another important finding is that among those who were immigrants, there were many more females than used to be thought. It used to believe that there was overwhelmingly males who came to Britain, usually assumed to be in war bands. Now the evidence suggests that given there was nearly as many women as men, it suggests a less violent form of migration. What these excavations do tell us is that there was a constant internal and external immigration and movement throughout the period, from the final decades of Roman rule through the Romano-British period right up to the early medieval times. No longer can assumptions be made on the origin of a buried person simply by examining the method of their burial. The Venerable Bead, with his ecclesiastical history of the English people, was aiming to show the superiority of the Roman Church over the Celtic Church and the English people over the Celts. His history was actually more of a propaganda piece. To do this, he wrote out how St. Augustine came to pagan England and almost single-handedly converted the population to Christianity. Bede spent his entire life in a Northumbrian monastery and so relied on other people's writings and accounts, including Gildas. He used the term English at a time when no English state existed. In other Latin and Old English sources, references to England only become regular after the Danish king Canute fought his way to the kingship. It was only in the 1020s that Canute is styled King of England. It's thought he was the first person to actually be given that title. It's also mistaken to imagine that the name evolved in some organic way amongst the population, because in fact, the contracted form England, Ingerland, is a Norse name, as are Ireland and Scotland. Bede recounts the reason for the Celtic Church was destroyed it was basically God's punishment for not following the Roman Church. It's only when Pope Gregory the Great sent Augustine to Kent that Christianity is reintroduced. In fact, there were two distinct efforts to convert the pagan Angles and Saxons. Besides the Roman Augustine, there were Irish monks also trying to convince the pagan rulers. Besides disagreeing on things like the date of Easter, the shape of the tonsure of monks, there were differences in structure and practice. The Roman Church was based on bishops and dioceses using the old Roman imperial structures. The Celtic Church was much more decentralized, based on monasteries located on islands. Another great difference is that the Celtic clergy would walk everywhere, where the Roman clergy would always ride horses. It was much more ostentatious. Now, how voluntary the conversions of the general population were is open to question. The approach of both churches was to try and convince the ruler of a kingdom by inducements, gifts and treasures, or the promise of military victories. The common people were then instructed to convert, and those who did not were basically forced to. So many of the pagan kings would actually almost road test. They would be given, they would sort of say we will convert if we can, if I win this next battle that I'm going to fight. And that's how they approached it. It was, and the other advantage that the Roman Church had is that it was very wealthy, whereas the Celtic Church, not so much. Now the language, this has always been something that people have pointed to. The change from Common Brythonic and Latin to what became Old English is probably the most dramatic change, one of the most dramatic changes anyway. There's no doubt that in a very short time, the people of England developed a common language based on Germanic languages. This has often been used as an argument for the invasion and replacement theory. But with the increased trade across the North Sea, it's now thought that the Celts started to learn Germanic languages to facilitate that. There are examples of this elsewhere. In East Africa, the spread of Swahili was through trade, and through trade it became the dominant language in many parts of East Africa. Modern linguists now see a more subtle changes with the Old Brythonic language influencing the structure and word order of Old English that facilitated its development into modern English. During the evolution from Old English to modern English, a number of modifications took place that saw it change its type from a synthetic language to become a largely analytical language. Now, I'm very not very good at this language thing, so you'll have to, if anybody else knows more about it, you're welcome to join in. A new approach, it suggests the reason for the high level of analytically in English is its contact with the Brythonic languages. This theory is mainly based on the fact that English and Welsh, the modern equivalents, share a common development from synthetic to analytic, which sets them both apart from other members of their language families. For example, English would be counted in the Germanic family and Welsh in the Celtic. And in these other languages, this development is not evident. And it's also been recognised that there are more Celtic loanwords than used to be thought, and Celtic influence also shows in place names and personal names. That's a sort of definition of synthetic and analytic language. So I'm very vague on this bit. So the idea That the Brythonic people were primitive, warlike tribes only to be civilized by the Romans is now thought to be false. Trade with the continent was ongoing, and the Brythonic tribes were organized, stable societies. Things did change with the Roman takeover, with the Brythonic population becoming Romanized, albeit in a patchy way. With the final departure of the Romans, society did not collapse, making it easy for a takeover by Anglo-Saxons and Jews. These people were already here and trading. The Romano-British carried on with their lifestyle in the west of the island, while those in the east adapted to different cultures. There are lots of unanswered questions about why and how the Germanic tribes became dominant enough to change the nature of what was to become England. At the moment, we just don't know. These historians questioning the old assumptions are saying that there is actually no evidence of an invasion at this time. There is evidence of people who were later called Anglo-Saxons and had been settling in Britain much earlier than thought and actually integrating into the Romano-British and Brythonic communities so as to become indistinguishable from each other based on the use of everyday items and their method of burial. These historians are not saying that there was no invasion, but until real evidence is found, no one can say for definite there was. There is some element of this. If there was some element of this, then certainly it was not on the scale that used to be thought. So how and why did England change from a Brythonic to a largely Germanic culture? We just don't know. That's it. Thank you.